Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fortify Rights press conference and the launch of our latest report, Genocide by Attrition. I am Amy Smith, the director of Fortify Rights, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. If I could ask the other speakers to also please turn on their cameras. We're still waiting for one speaker who we're running into some technical difficulties, so we're trying to work that out right now. But hopefully she'll be able to join us shortly. While we wait, there are a few technical notes that I'll go through. So first of all, we have simultaneous Burmese and Rohingya language interpretation available for today's discussion. To access the interpreters, please click the globe at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select your preferred language. If you are having technical problems, and we are, but please feel free to send a chat on Zoom to Fortify Rights, and our team will be on hand to help sort you out, or at least we will try. So hopefully that will work out. We'd also like to encourage you to please feel free to ask questions to our four speakers today. To ask a question, we have a chat function in Zoom or Facebook. So please feel free to chat your questions there. Also, feel free to communicate in English, Burmese, or in the Thai language, and our team will help to pass those questions along to me and also to our panelists. Following the presentations, if you'd like to ask a question directly to the panel, please click the raise hand button, which is also at the bottom of your screen, and we'll unmute your microphone so you can ask directly your question. If you're able to when you're asking your questions, if you'd please also identify yourself and your affiliation and indicate who you'd like to ask your question to. We'll be giving priority to working journalists, so also please let us know if you're a member of the media. I'd also like to remind participants that today's event is being recorded and live streamed on our social media platforms. So just to make that reminder. I think that's it for logistics, and I see that our final speaker has also joined us, so we can get started. Just to introduce this report, for those of you who are not familiar with, or those of you who are familiar with Fortify Rights work and our reporting, you'll know that our work is largely focused on documenting violations that are taking place in the present day or in the immediate past. And really that's with the purpose of finding solutions and creating a more rights-respecting future within Southeast Asia. This report, though, is a little bit different. It's examining violations that have taken place decades earlier and in countries very far from Southeast Asia. Specifically, it's digging into the archives of the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide with the purpose of finding ways to stop the ongoing genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. So I think the question is, what led us to turn to the Holocaust and Rwandan genocide when looking for answers about what's taking place in Myanmar? Well, we've seen through our documentation work that there are often patterns that emerge when violations are being committed. We see that tactics often get recycled and that behaviors often are repeated. With this report, what we're looking into is what led into the horrific outcomes of the Holocaust and Rwandan genocide. Because if we can understand the systems and the structures that led to those genocides, then we might be able to stop and prevent those same horrific conditions from happening in Myanmar right now. In particular, this report is looking at the use of identity documents to carry out genocide. It's a tactic that's been used in the Holocaust to try to eliminate the Jewish population in the 1930s and 40s. And it's also been used in the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi population in 1994. So concerningly, this is a tactic that we're also seeing with the ongoing genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. So this is why we felt this was a really important topic to be looking into. For this report, we had the honor of working with and learning from Dr. Ken McLean, who is a Clark University professor at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Ken is also a senior advisor to Fortify Rights, and he's the co-author of this report. So once you're done reading this report, I'd also like to recommend that you grab a copy of Ken's new book, Crimes in Archival Form, Human Rights, Fact Production in Myanmar. It's available on order on Amazon, as well as any bookstores that might still be in existence. So there's your promo. Today, Ken will be able to provide insights on the use of genocide, on the use of identity documents in genocide. And he'll also be sharing about his research into this report. John Quinley III is also here, and he's going to be able to share information on the current situation for the Rohingya in Myanmar following the coup and the continued use of national identification cards, or NVCs, by the Myanmar junta. John has been a senior human rights specialist at Fortify Rights since 2016, and he's also the co-author of this report. He also led and authored our 2019 report, Tools of Genocide, which provides an in-depth analysis of the NVC process in Myanmar. And this demonstrates how these cards have worked to strip Rohingya of access to full citizenship rights. So when you're done reading this report and Ken's book, there's also the 2019 report that you can look at. And then we also have Dr. 𝘎𝘰𝘭𝘰𝘤𝘪𝘵𝘆, who will be able to share impacts of the NVC process and ongoing genocide for the Rohingya community. Dr. Parveen is an amazing woman who, in addition to being a pediatric consultant and a child and adolescent psychiatrist, is the chair of the European Rohingya Council and the co-founder of the Rohingya Medics organization. She herself is also a Rohingya and is joining us from Germany, where it's, I think, 4 a.m. So we're just going to hope that she can remain awake for the duration of this discussion. Hoping you have a lot of coffee there. And finally, we have Arslan Suleiman, who will give us some insight into the ongoing case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which we hope that this report will help to contribute to that case. Arslan is counsel with 𝘕𝘠𝘬𝘯𝘰𝘤𝘪𝘵𝘀𝘎 international litigation arbitration practice in Washington, D.C., and he's currently supporting the representation of the Gambia in the case against Myanmar at the ICJ. So I'm going to now hand it over to the speakers, who have each been asked to share about 5 minutes of some initial points before we open the discussion up to questions from the audience. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Ken McLean.
Thank you, Amy, for the warm welcome and the book plug, unnecessary, but much appreciated. It's an honor and a privilege to join all of you for the release of our latest report, Genocide by Attrition. And my opening comments will be brief, but focus on the overarching arguments presented in the comparative section of the report. These arguments frame the fact-finding specifics that my colleagues will share with you shortly. Now, the comparative section, in it, we highlight 3 case studies, as Amy mentioned, on the use of identity documents. The first with the Holocaust of the Jewish people in the 1930s and 40s in Nazi Germany. Second, the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi people in 1994. And of course, the ongoing genocide targeting Rohingya in Myanmar. Now, when you read the report, a number of things will jump out at you, at least we hope they do. And the first one is, quite obviously, that disturbing similarities exist across all 3 cases regarding the role official identity documents play in the efficient and effective marginalization, dehumanization, and ultimately the rapid extermination of populations targeted for genocide. These similarities, the historical background, will then inform some of the recent fact-finding by Fortify Rights on Project Flowerbed, which some of my other colleagues will speak to shortly. Well, history indicates that genocidal policies are not necessarily predicated on problematic official identification documentation. Such documentation can, however, contribute to the creation of monolithic, essentialized identity categories that can facilitate atrocity crimes when exploited by governments or regimes in highly polarized societies to subdivide a country's population. Identity documents can do this in a number of ways, but most often by symbolically and bureaucratically reinforcing an us versus them ideological framing of both real and imagined group differences in intentionally divisive terms. Such framing, the us versus them, combined with discourse that relies on fear and hate to portray a targeted group as subhuman or non-human, may be used to justify official and unofficial forms of discrimination, persecution, and/or violence. Therefore, government solutions to the perceived threats that the other allegedly poses often take the form of apartheid-like conditions, wholesale domination, and/or physical elimination. Three processes we see both with regard to the Jews during the Holocaust, the Tutsi in Rwanda, and of course, most recently, the Rohingya in Myanmar. Now, identification documents can also contribute to what we refer to in the report as genocide by attrition. And that concept refers to the gradual destruction of a protected group by reducing their strength through sustained indirect methods of destruction. So while many of Fortify Rights reports have focused on the massive, widespread and systematic violence against Rohingya during the clearance operations, for example, this report looks at the corrosive effects of everyday forms of persecution that are made possible through the use of identity documents and discrimination attached to them. So in such context, the long-term systematic denial of human rights can result in a slow process of annihilation rather than the immediate unleashing of violent death. For example, identification documents help facilitate restrictions on basic rights, such as the right to freedom of movement, which in turn can limit access to livelihoods, education, health services, and so on. Such tactics may contribute or amount to genocidal acts under international law, where they deliberately inflict on group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, either in whole or in part. And finally, as all three case studies reveal, identification cards and other forms of documentation that force a person to be affiliated with a governmentally defined group and then exposes those persons to profiling and human rights abuses based on that ascribed group identity can play and often do an instrumental role in genocidal processes. Such classifications promote de-individualization, dehumanization, and demonization that can result in elimination, that is, the destruction of life. While the details of each form of polarization vary quite obviously between the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide and the Rohingya of Myanmar, it is clear that identification documents make it bureaucratically easier to identify, persecute, and then kill targeted populations on a widespread, systematic, and massive scale. Genocide by attrition, which facilitates these outcomes through indirect methods of destruction, must consequently be taken seriously as part of the effort to understand both past genocides and to prevent future ones. So thank you. And with that, I turn the microphone over, I believe, to John. Are you next?
Thank you, Dr. Ken, and thank you, Amy. Firstly, I wanted to thank the Rohingya in Bangladesh and in Myanmar who took the time to speak with us for this report and shed light on the denial of citizenship that is taking place under the junta. It's also been a total honor to work with Dr. Ken on this report, as well as my colleagues, 𝘕 and others on the Fortify Rights team. So on top of the comparative section that Ken went through, the report also exposes how since the deadly attempted military coup in February 1st, 2021, the junta continues to deny the existence of the Rohingya and is forcing or coercing Rohingya to accept national verification cards, known as NVCs, a document that confers no rights and identifies Rohingya as foreigners in Myanmar. Rohingya who applied for the NVCs since the coup that we spoke to told us the junta is continuing the authorities' earlier practices of refusing to allow Rohingya to identify as Rohingya in the application process and instead require them to register as Bengali or other foreign identities. I'll give a few examples of what Rohingya told us during the interview process. One Rohingya man, 30, in Butidong Township, who applied for an NVC after the coup, told my colleagues and I, junta authorities asked my religion They asked my ethnicity. They wrote Bengali at the immigration office. And later he told us, our name is Rohingya. A 19-year-old Rohingya from Minbya. Hello? Was it muted? Are we good? A 19-year-old Rohingya from Minbya township in Rakhine State told us they want to make us illegal migrants and Bengali people as a strategy to exclude us from citizenship. The junta also continues a campaign to erase and destroy Rohingya people by imposing very restrictive measures, including on the population, including through denying them access to travel. For example, an internal administrative order obtained by Fortify Rights by the junta-run General Administration Department of Butidong Township in November 2021 reiterates long-standing restrictions that deny Rohingya freedom of movement, stating that Bengali people can only travel after obtaining legal permission, and that breaching the order will result in strong action taken under existing laws. The junta, as Ken noted, like other genocidal regimes, claims such restrictions are necessary to protect security and the rule of law. Even before the junta took power in the military coup in February, Fortify Rights documented in our report, Tools of Genocide, an uptick in Myanmar authorities' efforts to coerce or force Rohingya to accept NVCs prior to the widespread and systematic army-led attacks in 2016 and 2017. There is evidence that there's a link and a correlation between Myanmar authorities' efforts to force Rohingya to accept NVCs and their efforts to destroy the Rohingya as a group. These demonstrated links between the NVC process and genocidal acts should be a focus of ongoing investigations and legal proceedings. The main thrust of this report is that the NVC process should be abolished immediately, and that UN member states should deny the Myanmar junta access to weapons, finances, political legitimacy, and the UN Security Council should immediately refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. I'm happy to answer questions if they come up around the documentation. There's a full chapter of documentation that took place. So we interviewed over 20 people, and we analyzed 5 internal documents. But happy to hand it back over to Amy and to Dr. Parveen.
And I will hand it over to Dr. Parveen to take it over from there.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was a very generous introduction. You were very kind. I would like to say sorry. I think because of me, there was a technical problems because I've used all the computer, it's not working. Anyway, I managed it. And I would like to thank all the speakers of today's conference. And my special, on behalf of Rohingyas, goes thanks to the Fortify Rights teams. You people have been doing a lot since I'm in the political journey and standing for the people, for the Burmese people, and especially for the Rohingyas. Thank you so much once again. Before we go to the, how did this NVC national verification landed? If we go back, you know, we all know that the citizenship rights is a legal identity which grants a person, a human being, privileges and the rights, rights to vote, rights to candidate, rights to free of movement, rights to educate yourself, rights to go out of the country, re-entry, and some other privileges. Unfortunately, these privileges is so far majority of us, I mean, beside the Rohingya community, are enjoying in this digital era, in this 21st century. But we Rohingyas are still struggling to be accepted by our own motherland, Myanmar. And we are still struggling to restore those rights which we once upon a time enjoyed like every citizen of Myanmar. let us go to the little bit of history. And that is like in British colonial time, Rohingyas as people of Arakan enjoyed all the rights as a citizen. Then in 1942, after the invasion of the fascist Japanese, joined with some fascist or racist Rakhines and with the military of Myanmar, and they started to launch an operation to wipe us out from those days. We were living in the southern part, then we landed up in northern part of Arakan. That was already a signal to the genocide. So this tool of our identification, used as a genocidal tool systematically, regime by regime, government by government, not only under the military rule, but also under the democracy, like in 2015. So in after the independence, Myanmar, after the independence of Myanmar, we managed to, we managed to, there was a tension, and the Mujahideen were also fighting, and then the first prime minister of Myanmar government, UNO, made a ceasefire, and then according to the Mayu frontier administrative area, we was given semi-autonomy, and we were given the full citizenship rights of Myanmar. Then 1978 came, that was the first, in 1961 and 62 took over the military government. There was a coup happened, and the General Nevin took over, and then operations after operations it happened. And in 1978, that was the in the history you can see there is a dragon operation, King Dragon operation, or Nagamin, I think in Burmese, and that was a time where 100,000 to 250,000 Rohingyas had to flee, leave the Arakan state, and come to Bangladesh. Then after going back, then they, due to after the involvement of the international community, Bangladesh helped us. We went back. The first repatriation took place, and we don't know what happened to those people. After going back, the systematically, the persecution for the Rohingyas were used. The citizenship rights that we were enjoying, it took over, and then our status got into worsen and worsen, and then it came 1982. Then in 1982, then in 1982. Then we were given, instead of the NRC, we were replaced, we were told that we can apply for the pink card. Then the pink card was not issued to us, and the Rohingyas were given only the white cards, and it landed up in the NVCs. So we, being the indigenous people, even in the history, the first prime minister of Myanmar even called us, addressed us as one of the indigenous people of Myanmar, and also address us as our identity Rohingyas. Unfortunately, systematically discriminatory genocidal rules and policies were followed by the authorities, not only the military regime, but also by the democratic regime. In 2015, none of the Rohingyas and Muslims were allowed to vote. Now, this NVC process continued, and we are still forced to use it. So it is very important, which is this 1982 and the NVC, these are under the arbitrary and the discriminatory manner, and the international community should try their best to give us rights which we once upon enjoyed in our country, in our motherland. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perveen. I'm going to hand it over to Arsalan to share a little bit more about his work on accountability and where things are going with the ICJ case.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to everyone at Fortify Rights and Dr. Ken and John for this very important and really important and helpful report in contextualizing what happens to the Rohingya and what is happening in terms of the NVC cards, the national verification cards, and how that process in particular is being used to reinforce and carry on the ongoing genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar. Just for the English speakers, I'm speaking a little slowly because I know there's simultaneous interpretation happening as well. So just bear with me a little bit on that. As a brief reminder, in terms of the Gambia's case against Myanmar before the International Court of Justice, that case, if you remember, was filed back in 2019, and the court held a hearing in December of 2019 to hear Gambia's request for provisional measures, which were measures meant to protect the Rohingya population as the case proceeds. And in a unanimous decision, the court in January of 2020 imposed provisional measures against Myanmar, ordering it to not commit further acts of genocide and to take affirmative action to prevent genocide, and also to preserve evidence of genocide and to report back to the court periodically twice a year on its implementation of those measures. And the case continues. The latest phase of the case is that Myanmar had filed what are called preliminary objections. These are basically objections to the jurisdiction of the court. There was a hearing held on that in February of this year, and we expect the court to rule on that before the end of the year, perhaps much sooner than that. And after the court rules on those preliminary objections, the case will then proceed to the merits. And the next stage in that is that Myanmar would still have to file its responsive substantive brief in the case, because Gambia filed its primary substantive brief in the case in October of 2020. And so that is still to happen. And eventually, once Myanmar files its substantive brief, the counter memorial, then we would have, the court would be in a position either to have an additional round of briefing or to go to a merits hearing. And I just mentioned all that because I know many people are wondering how long is the case going to take and where things are with the case. Unfortunately, it still has a little ways to go because of the long time frame that the court gives for the governments involved. But I do want to make clear that the case is proceeding. The implementation reports have been filed on time, and the Gambia has been responding to those implementation reports. And the work of human rights organizations and defenders and experts and Rohingya community in updating everyone about what's going on is really critically important, because the Gambia uses all of these reports and updates and even the news reports in order to ensure that the court is aware of developments and is taking that into account as it considers whether the provisional measures are sufficient to protect the Rohingya from further violent genocidal acts. And just coming back to the report, it's a really influential, I think, and helpful report because it goes into further detail about how the NVC cards are intimately linked in with the broader web of discriminatory and restrictive policies that create this slow burning genocide that's been ongoing for a number of years and is still ongoing, even though the more violent clearance operations aren't happening in northern Rakhine State at the moment. And in particular, the discriminatory policies which limit Rohingya from accessing health services and education and livelihoods, a lot of those are linked back to travel restrictions and other restrictions on marriage and family. And the authorities, as is made clear in the report, have really linked the NVC process to reinforce all of those restrictions. Rohingya who try to travel are often arrested and forced to take the NVC card and are not allowed to travel without the NVC card. For any Rohingya who want to be repatriated back to Myanmar, are being forced to take the NVC card. For any who want to go and access health facilities and others are being told they have to take the NVC card. And as is made clear in the report, that whole process is meant to force the Rohingya to give up citizenship rights, to give up their identity, and to essentially accept their place as non-citizen stateless people who are subjected to all kinds of discriminatory policies and are vulnerable to further acts of violence. And so I just wanted to reiterate our thanks to all of the Rohingya who contribute to these reports and to Fortify Rights and other human rights organizations and defenders who do the important work in documenting this, because all of it is very important and useful for the accountability mechanisms that are working to hopefully provide justice for the Rohingya and for others in Myanmar who also face discriminatory actions and violence. So thank you to you all.
Thank you for that, Arsalan, and to all our panelists. It's very helpful to get your reflections on this, and also to hear more about where this report, the findings and the recommendations of the report. This is now an opportunity for people who have been joining us on the webinar to also ask questions. And I'll open it up for questions. Please feel free to use the chat function if you're on Zoom. I think our Facebook is now working so that you can also ask a question if you're on Facebook. And if you'd like to directly ask a question, just use the raise hand button and we'll unmute your microphone so you can actually ask directly. And again, just to remind, if you can please let us know your affiliation and it also indicate who you'd like to ask the question to. But just to kick it off, I'd like to go back to Ken and ask you to share a little bit more about the term genocide by attrition. This is the title of the report, and I think it's a term that isn't super familiar for a lot of people. It would be great to hear a little bit more about that, and also how that term represents what is taking place in Myanmar and for the Rohingya people.
Great, thank you, Amy. It's a great question. And for me, the easiest way to perhaps understand it is through a metaphor. That if you think of water and a drop by drop by drop, by itself is insignificant, but with enough time, it can erode mountains. It wears things away. Even water has a corrosive effect. And what I think we're trying to get at in this report, and I think Arsalan captured it very nicely, that there's a tendency in reports like these to enumerate violations. The violation to freedom of movement, to marriage, to family, access to healthcare, education, and so on. And we provide examples of each of those things, but we do not always pay close enough attention to how they interlock and how they reinforce one another. And it's really the NBC document that provides the structure with which the junta and local authorities in northern Rakhine State tie together a wide range of fundamental rights and then systematically deny them to ordinary Rohingya on a daily basis. So these violations are not spectacular, like the clearance operations, when you're looking at 750,000 people on the run for their very lives, but an individual by individual, a household by household, family by family, and they're not just dreams and aspirations for a better future, but their very being, the core of what makes them a person, in this case, a Rohingya person, is denied, rejected, day in, day out, time and time again, if you don't have the card. But if you have the card, you have effectively denied who you are in order to have some rights. So it's a real catch-22 for the Rohingya, and my heart goes out to them. And we call it genocide by attrition, just like the drop by drop of water can erode away a mountain. These kinds of targeted persecution against Rohingya simply because they are Rohingya erodes their ability to reproduce themselves and their families as Rohingya. They cannot learn in their own language. They cannot support their families with livelihoods and so on, because every time they turn around, they are denied, blocked, and persecuted, and in some cases killed. So that's why we sought to link the terms, and hopefully that explanation makes it a little clearer about what we're trying to communicate in the report.
Absolutely, a really poetic way of putting it, and for describing a situation that we also see on the ground. We're working with the Rohingya community, so thank you for that. We have a really good question. This one goes to Arsalan, and it's from a second-year Burmese Indian student who's from Yangon. His question is about the ICJ case, and it's a question I think we all have. I'm not sure of the answer to it, but Arsalan, maybe you can enlighten us. His question is, how are the odds on winning the case? And I'm assuming he's asking about winning against Myanmar. So.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the questioner. It's a hard question to answer because there are a lot of different factors that would go into how the court will ultimately rule. I mean, I think one thing to recognize is that the court has established a very high bar, a very high standard for finding genocide. And the hard part of a case for genocide is to prove that the intent behind the actions are to destroy a particular group in whole or in part. And so that's a big challenge in terms of the proof, because you have to prove intent. And unless there are documents or testimony that can show directly that this was the intent behind certain policies, then you have to show through circumstantial evidence that that was the intent. And we also have to remember that the court has yet to ever make a finding of state responsibility for genocide. So there have been previous cases before the ICJ, Bosnia versus Serbia, Croatia versus Serbia. In the Bosnia case, the court made a finding of an act of genocide with the Srebrenica genocide, but it did not find that the state of Serbia was responsible there. And so we are seeking in this case against Myanmar for the first time for the court to hold the state responsible, to hold Myanmar responsible for this genocide. We think the evidence that we've put together is very strong, that it shows that there is some direct evidence of the intent behind these actions, as well as a very strong circumstantial case when you look at factors like the discriminatory policies, the hate speech, the sexual violence, the brutality of the actions themselves, the nature of the organization of the operations, and the impunity afterwards, the cover-up afterwards, the destruction of evidence afterwards. All of those circumstantial evidence support a case of genocide, as does some of the direct evidence, which is the words that soldiers spoke when they were killing, the orders that soldiers have testified to as having been given to kill everyone they can see or hear. So I think we have a very strong case, but I don't want to understate the high bar that the Gambia has to meet here. It is a high bar, and we hope that we will meet it.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. So we have a question from Mr. Mohammed Rizwan. He's going to ask directly. I've never done this before, so I'm going to try and make this happen. Oh, there we go. So I think, Mr. Mohammed, you're now in the room, and I think you can speak directly. Can you hear us? Mr. Mohammed Rizwan?
Good morning to all of you, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Do you have a question for one of the panelists? I think there may be some connection issues. Mr. Mohammed, can you ask your question?
Yes, thank you for giving me opportunity. I wanna ask our community leader, Dr. 𝘕𝘵𝘭𝘰𝘤𝘪𝘵𝘪𝘏, with our Rohingya language.
Yes, please.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू.
Walaikum salam.
जी आयरंदे नामले मोहम्मद रिजवान आयरंदे आरकान और फातर किल्लर
जी.
तो आए हम मलेशिया लोलो से मान के हम मलेशिया में जाती थे
जी.
तो आर 45 आइटम में क्या आर नेशनल
Verification card.
NBC कार्डर मुताबिक डिस्कशन का सत्या अल्लाह मान के अनियो मान के आर लेबास रे आर यहाँ ना उन्हें ट्रांसलेशन को दियो कला आती आय फंडा हुई हिसाबे मान के आय 2017 में पास या फ्री गुजी 10 क्लास में पास या फ्री वाले फेल गिलाम बॉय फेलता बारे एक बছর বইতে পারে 2019 में चार बार एक्चुअल दे फ्री गुजिलाम बॉय तो लॉकडाउन जरिया है अब फ्री ना भारी तो हिंगला आरतिया हासगे अन जानो दी हिसाबे आरती बरम में इंग्लिश को दियान खदुर कमजोर दियान और हासगे जानो आरा है तो इंग्लिश पता ना जानी दी हिसाबे हासगे अनेक गो आरा कोमा बितले लेदार आसे नाला अनर रिप्रेजेंटेटिव साइड दे हासगे विशेष करी आरा अपॉर्चुनिटी दियान अल्लाह ते आरा गो यूथ जनरेशन और मुताबिक आरा जनरेशन बितत नहीं है यो जनरेशन बितत यान दर हासगे तो मनो हदे आरती आईडे नावला नावदा कल आरस बोवा जिंदानी की गुजरी गिगई नंती आईडे आर जनरेशन कल फ्यूचर जनरेशन कल आरती इ मुश्किल म्हणजे सामना कराना पड़दिल्ला अनरा इ रास्ता में थे एरिया में कामयाबी दे पेन टाइम हुन मौजूदा आशा दो मजगरी आरा यूथ जनरेशन बितती तो मतरवती खाना अनरा लगे खाना दो हता है वरना मुलाये कोना अनरा सुरो बाई हिसाब तो मर हतार में अनर से बुलबुल माइ बियादी मा फादे अनरा बियागुन तो मासन सामत तो यांदर जे आराम में आसे दे 45 आइटर जूम मीटिंग में आसे तार अनरा बियागुन खाना ट्रांसलेशन कर दियो तो अनरा हता मुहुनी वाला इंशाल्लाह तैयार आसम इन इंस्पिरेशन करी रोहंजा लैंग्वेज में मुहुन मध्य कला इंग्लिश का तह दूर मती क्रिटिक्स नॉट हिसाबे अनरा से अनरा फरदम दो या अस्सलाम वालेकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू.
Okay.
I think
Amy? Yeah, Amy,
that-
I think there was a translation came, or do I need to, this is a gentleman, a young boy who had to leave the country, and he was studying there, but due to the COVID and other issues, documentations issues, he had to leave to Malaysia. And now he's just requesting that to think about the young generation who are still suffocating and living these atrocities inside the Arakan. So he wanted to thank you people, especially the Fortify Rights, for launching this report. And it seems like he's quite upset, very hurt. He said, because we were neglected from our rights, we were never given the rights. Today, it's very difficult for me to speak in English and to talk in English to express myself. So he just were thanking you people and thanking me. So, and he said, please do not forget about the youth generation, Fortify Rights have been doing a lot of work, and such kind of documentations, it's really very important for the Rohingyas. We Rohingyas were unable to write, we were unable to document, and these atrocities have been happening. As I said recently, that we were enjoying the rights, and then came this full citizenship rights, then the pink rights, pink cards, then the white cards we were forced, now NVC. It is a very good document, and to show to the world, and especially to the accountability organizations and the processes, to put the weight that the genocide tool as using our identification and the genocide tool further. My question is to our friend and brother Suleiman, does it give you more weight to the people who are working for the ICJ, ICC, or to the Gambia? Will you submit such kind of documents which are officially reported by our Fortify Rights and others? Will it put a weight to process, or will it still be the same? Or what process, such kind of important reports, can they do something for us to get the justice? Because after all, we came in 2017, and from 2017, a 5-year-old boy became a 10 became a 15, and 15 became a 20. And there are 10,000 of our youth living over there who are supposed to go for education. Our children, more than 60% living in this camp, they need to live a normal life. This is not the life that they are living. And besides that, these reports, such reports, does the international community and the accountability process should not carry on, because there are only 300 and 350 Rohingyas left over, and still 120 Rohingyas are still living in the refugee camps, IDP camps in Sittwe. How such reports can put more weight? Because if I see this report, I hear the report, I feel there is already a huge weight which should fasten and speedy our process of accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll jump in, Amy, if that's okay. Yes, 𝘠𝘰𝘭𝘰𝘤𝘪𝘵, good to see you. And these reports are absolutely helpful. They are helpful for accountability processes like the ICJ case, because this type of report includes testimony from victims who are experiencing the discrimination of these processes. It also includes citations and references to the actual decrees and government policies that are implementing this, that show the actual discriminatory policies in action. And we have been using these types of reports as we update the court periodically through these implementation report procedures. And certainly in our memorial, in the Gambia's memorial, we cited to these types of reports, including reports by Fortify Rights and other human rights organizations, in order to provide the documentary evidence of the violations and the genocidal actions that we are seeking the court to recognize and declare as such. So it is absolutely important. But I also want to emphasize, because you're talking about the Rohingya who want to live their lives, who want to get back to education, who want to go back eventually, of course, to their homeland in Myanmar when there is a ability for them to do that in a safe and dignified manner. And so I think these type of reports should also put pressure on governments in the region, on Malaysia, on Indonesia, on ASEAN, on Western governments, the United States, the UK, Canada, others. I hope that they will be reading this report carefully, and I hope that this report will help them to implement the types of measures that are recommended in the report, the type of measures that will hopefully lead to changes in these policies and relief for the Rohingya who are in Myanmar, as well as creating that pathway for people to come back. But the accountability processes take time, and the accountability processes are backwards looking. They're looking at trying to find some sort of remedy for violations that have happened. They're not the best mechanism for dealing with the forward-looking situation, which is how do you create the conditions on the ground to allow people to live their lives freely again, and for people who were forced to leave the country to be able to come back. For that, the accountability processes are helpful and they're a part of the puzzle, but a really big part of that puzzle, that solution, is the political pressure from the international community, from other actors, regional actors as well, who have leverage with the Myanmar authorities and who can seek to have the change that's necessary implemented. It's a process that will involve many actors working together, and these reports are important because it creates a basis, it creates a stable foundation of evidence and knowledge that all actors can look to and cite and use to act upon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Perveen, and also Arsalan. We're still kind of working out how the translation works, but it was really helpful to have that summary. So thank you so much, Dr. Perveen. There's another question from Denise, who is with the Jesuit Refugee Services in Cambodia. She has an interesting question around the situation for Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh. As we know, there's over 1 million that are now in the world's largest refugee camps there. And her question is, what needs to be in place for a safe, dignified repatriation to Rakhine from Bangladesh? And also, what would be a safe process, including documents for return? And she is acknowledging it would not be the NVC. So how would that work? I know that John has looked into this and has been doing a lot of monitoring of the situation in Bangladesh. So I'm wondering if, John, you can jump in here.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and a great question. Just first of all, I think widespread repatriation at this time is probably not possible. That would be refoulement. There are small trickles of Rohingya people going back to Mongdaw and Butidong because the conditions in the camps, they're going informally, not through the formal repatriation process. This is because the situation in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh is quite restrictive, and living there is very difficult. So some families have informally gone back outside of the repatriation process. That being said, the junta took over in a coup last year and has attacked the whole population and is still persecuting Rohingya in Rakhine State, as we've shown in the report. This report is dedicated to 𝘕𝘠𝘭𝘰𝘤𝘪𝘵𝘀, a Rohingya leader who was assassinated in September 2021. One of his main recommendations before he was assassinated was to have restored citizenship rights before repatriation. And that was something that a lot of Rohingya people talk about in the camps. They want security, they want safety, they want citizenship, and they want accountability before returning back to Rakhine State. So all those things need to be in place before returns can happen. Back in 2019, under the NLD government, we released a report looking at the NVC process and potential returns. One of the recommendations we put in that report was for if a government was to take over and be stable and democratic, what would need to take place for them to return. So one of our recommendations is for all kind of identity documents to be recognized. And so that means Rohingya have documents dating back many, many years. They have white cards, they have CSCs, they have NRCs, they have family list. So these cards and even testimonial evidence from their families and generations before them could be used in verification processes when Rohingya decide they want to go back to Rakhine State.
Thank you so much for that, John. So I know, Dr. Ken McLean, you need to jump off, but before you go, if you'd like to give any wrapping up remarks, and we can, if the other panelists are willing to stay on, we do have some other questions that people are interested in. So if you're okay to stay, we can continue, and other panelists, other attendees who might have more questions, please feel free to stay. But Dr. Ken McLean, if you would like to share any final remarks.
I wish I had something that would beautifully wrap this up, and I don't, because the situation is so complex. But I really think that the distinction Arsalan made about looking backwards versus looking forwards, and they're not necessarily in opposition to one another. They shouldn't be, but we need to craft better ways of doing both at the same time so that no one, including the youth, are left out and see their futures lost, just as people before them lost their possible life choices and directions. So I think we could all do a better job, in other words, of linking the documentation that then feeds the accountability process with keeping the affected communities, in this case, the Rohingya, up to date, involved, and in conversation with the relevant stakeholders to see what can be done now while we're working for justice and accountability. What can we do now so that the suffering is reduced or mitigated in some way? And I think that's an area of an improvement for human rights organizations in general. And hopefully our Rohingya friends can make suggestions on how we might do that better moving forward. So I'll stop there. My apologies for having to leave. I hope the conversation is fruitful, and best of luck and best wishes for health to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ken. We really appreciate the contributions you made to this research, and it's an issue that we always are saying never again. And I think this is an important report to remember that this is still going on, and how we can stop it moving forward. So thank you so much for joining us. So just to continue, there's another question that has come in, and I think we all can have different answers to it. So I'm not sure who would like to take first stab at it, but the question has to do with the term accountability, and what exactly, if the question is about elaborating about precisely what accountability means in this context and how this report contributes to that. So I think accountability can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and certainly on this panel in particular. But I'm wondering if, John, you might want to kick it off and just share, around this report in particular, and why this was the issue that we were looking into, and how this is, where we're going with accountability on it.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. There's a lot of ongoing accountability processes taking place right now, the ICJ, the ICC, there's the IIMM. We hope that some of the information in this report could be used by the ICJ in The Hague. And we also hope that some of this information will be able to be used by the IIMM, the International Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar. So their mandate is to collect and preserve evidence. And so one of the things that we have in this report is 5 internal documents relating to that are from junta documents that talk about othering the Rohingya, so calling them Bengali or restricting their freedom of movement. And these are primary documents that are in the Burmese language that have come out after the coup. So we hope to submit these documents to international investigative mechanisms and other accountability mechanisms. But we also hope that it leads to action at the UN Security Council, and that the situation is referred to the International Criminal Court or an ad hoc tribunal. The Rohingya themselves have called for this for many, many years, and they've called for the inaction to stop. There's also processes that are ongoing. A colleague and friend, 𝘕𝘮 Kin, opened a case in Argentina, a universal jurisdiction case to hold military perpetrators accountable for the genocide that took place against his own people. So these kind of processes, we hope that this report can feed into, and that they can use, hopefully, moving forward. But I'll also let Dr. Parveen and 𝘕𝘮 speak on the same issue.
Okay, if I may, as a Rohingya, though I find myself as a genocidal survivor, and it gives us hope. It gives us hope that the more weight is happening to the accountability people will take. We have been knocking to the UN Securities or United Nations, so other organizations, other accountability processes, that there is a genocide going on. As I've said in my speech, that there is a systematic discrimination and the arbitrary policies, laws they have used a Rohingya documentation, Rohingya identification as a genocidal tool. And we see, and this report already says that the genocide is still going on. Beside, there is a case in ICC, ICJ, and universal jurisdiction, and there are other accountability processes are going on, but still the genocide NVC is used against the Rohingyas. Still the junta, the regime is still using NVCs to wipe us out further. So the people living inside Arakan right now are not safe. So the international community should take speedy or fast precautions, measures to bring these perpetrators to accountability. And it is also for the local regions like in India, they're also using such kind of tools to wipe out Assamese, the Muslims, and the other community. Other countries should start also on these such things. Such things will work. So it is very important that the international community, I know 𝘕𝘮 has said that it might take time and all this, but still, I hope that somebody will take such reports seriously, and on that basis, they will try to give justice to these 1 million Rohingyas who are waiting since 2017 or 16 and earlier. But after 2017, almost 1 million Rohingyas. As a Rohingya, it's a very important, which we could not bring it to the international community, which we could not bring it in the form of reports. So I'm sure it's only the positive. And I'm sure that such reports will put more weight. Thank you.
Go ahead, 𝘕𝘮.
I was just going to say those are great answers, and maybe we can move on to other questions so that we can get those in.
We do have a question from a journalist, and that question is about what happened for the verification process for citizenship, which the NLD government promised when it issued the NVCs. So as we know, this was a promise that was made, and I think this is one that maybe John, you can help to answer.
Yeah, thank you, and great question. The last report we wrote looked at the problems actually under the NLD government related to the national verification card process. Violations were actually, they still did not allow Rohingya to identify as Rohingya during the NVC process. This was under the NLD. We documented abuses, like beatings related to the NVC. We documented restrictions on freedom of movement related to the NVC and livelihoods. So there's been very few Rohingya people who have been able to get citizenship through the NVC process. So you would apply for the NVC, and then afterwards you would apply for, under the 1982 citizenship law, for citizenship. There's 3 tiers under the law: associate, naturalized, and like kind of like a full citizenship. And Rohingya, we looked at in our last report, we looked at many Rohingya are not granted full citizenship rights. So they're only granted one of the other tiers, and that those tiers can be stripped of them at any time. So it's not a sustainable solution for Rohingya. So one of our recommendations is for the 1982 law to be abolished, and for citizenship in Myanmar not to have 3 categories, and it not to be based off race and ethnicity. That's something that we recommended in the report under the NLD. And so I think, the NLD process of verifying Rohingya was really problematic. We're happy for the journalist that asked, we're happy to share the old report and other recommendations we had for the NLD at that time.
Thank you for that, John. Also, you'll see in the chat that there's some Burmese text there. For our Burmese listeners, we're having some problem with our interpreter. So he's trying to get his headphones fixed, but I think the interpretation is coming in and out. But we can share the report, and also if you have questions, so please share it with our team, and we can follow up with you afterwards. And sorry about that. So another question is from a PhD researcher in New Delhi, 𝘕𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘦. He's working on she is working on statelessness of Rohingya, and the question is, I'll start with 𝘕𝘯. The question is, does an apology statement issued by the National Unity Government vis-a-vis the Rohingya help the case at the International Court of Justice in any way? And then there's another question also for John, but if we can start with 𝘕𝘯.
Thanks, Amy. What really helps in terms of the case is further evidence of the genocidal crimes committed. And so I think the actions and statements by the NUG is welcome as a reflection of the fact that the treatment of the Rohingya has been criminal and genocidal. And certainly for the societal reconciliation that needs to happen in Myanmar, it is promising to see leaders, including leaders of the NUG, making statements that acknowledge their shortcomings in the past and making commitments for reforms and changes in the future. I think that's all welcome and a necessary part of the long-term reconciliation process that is necessary to help heal Myanmar society generally. But in terms of the ICJ case, what's more helpful is evidence of what happened during the genocidal clearance operations. And to the extent that any former officials from that time period have such information and evidence to share, we would certainly call for them to make that type of evidence and information available. And they can do so through entities like the 𝘕𝘠𝘠𝘠, the International Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, so that that information could then be made available to processes like at the International Criminal Court and the Gambia's case at the ICJ.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And John, there's another question that's from the same person, and it's around education, which is also an issue that I know is very important for the Rohingya people and has been a real issue because of the NVC process. The question is about recently admitted Rohingya students to 𝘕𝘠𝘬 University who were forced to take the NVC cards. And the question is, were they actually admitted? And then also, can they really access this opportunity of higher education under the prevailing conditions? So I'm not sure if you know specifically about the students that this person is mentioning, but maybe you can share a little bit more about how these restrictions are affecting education for Rohingya.
Thank you, Amy, and great question. Yeah, there has, we've heard reports that a number of Rohingya students, of about a dozen or more, have been admitted to 𝘕𝘠𝘬 University, the capital of Rakhine State. We've also heard reports that these students had to take NVC cards in order to be admitted to 𝘕𝘠𝘬 University. We have not documented that ourselves, but we have heard credible reports of that happening. And I think it's an issue that needs to be looked into. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's been many decades of Rohingya people, either because they're restricted from traveling, or there's issues between the Rakhine and Rohingya community for not being able to access education in Rakhine State. So you talk to Rohingya people that are in the internment camps and in the villages surrounding the cities and towns, and there's major lack of educational opportunities, and also there are restrictions on even accessing educational opportunities for Rohingya people in Rakhine State still. I also just want to say this report is not about documenting restrictions in Bangladesh, but just so people know, there's about 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh right now, and the government has recently become really restrictive and shut down home-based and private-based learning centers in the camps. And these are Rohingya-run learning centers in the Bangladeshi camps. And a lot of these Rohingya people are genocide survivors, and they fled the atrocities and the persecution that's ongoing that we're talking about. And one of the baseline things that they deserve is education in those camps. And so I encourage people to speak openly about those restrictive processes happening in Bangladesh as well.
The next question is also, it's not directly related to the report, but also something that I know we've been looking into, and it has to do with Rohingya trafficking. So John, I know this is going back to some issues you've been looking into. You're in high demand right now. But the question is, in the context of escalating tensions in Rakhine, how will the Rohingya be impacted, and are the increasing flows of Rohingya trafficked out of Myanmar anyway linked to the NVC policy?
Yeah, I think the smuggling and trafficking flows are definitely linked to the ongoing persecution in Rakhine State, and that includes the NVC process. We released a report a few years ago documenting crimes against humanity around the trafficking syndicates in Thailand and Malaysia. We released that report with 𝘠𝘠𝘭𝘠, the National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, and that showed that trafficking was taking place for many years, and that trafficking process is still ongoing, although a bit smaller, quite a bit smaller than it was before. But recently a boat landed even in Thailand, and and the Thai authorities are right now detaining temporarily, I think, a group of Rohingya that landed in southern Thailand from a boat. And so the Thais should allow UNHCR to access those people. They're potentially trafficking survivors, and those people we heard are coming from Bangladesh. But I think, yeah, definitely the people leaving Rakhine State and right now is because of the ongoing persecution, and it will create unsafe routes for people to leave. And authorities in Myanmar, junta authorities, are continuing to arrest Rohingya for leaving their villages, leaving their townships, and leaving the state.
Thank you for that, John. This next question is from Felicity Salina, who is with Manusha Foundation. That's a grassroots organization based in Bangkok. And her report, or her question is asking about, in the report, one of the recommendations that we have is to the UN and to civil society. And the request is to enact a coordinated response to the NVC process. So her question is, how would this response look like, and how feasible would it be in light of and perhaps similar actions taken vis-a-vis the Rohingya Holocaust situation? Unfortunately, I think Dr. Ken McLean might have been best suited to answer that last part of the question. But maybe John, and I'm wondering if Dr. Praveen, you might have some other thoughts also about how civil society and that coordination around the NVC process might work. But John, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Dr. Praveen, I don't have much to say. In 2019, we documented how at least 5 international humanitarian organizations in Rakhine State were either coercively or kind of not putting a policy in place to make their Rohingya staff members get NVCs. It allows those Rohingya staff aid workers to travel a little bit better. And we documented a few incidences after the military coup of that trend still happening. And so one of our recommendations is for international humanitarian organizations to come out with a coordinated response on the NVC process. We've met with embassies and international groups over the years, and some people don't see the major problems with the NVC process. They, even foreign embassies in Yangon and in the region don't see the major problems with the NVC, and they see it as kind of a card that can help facilitate travel between townships, which of course is needed for humanitarian organizations to operate and supply aid and services to Rohingya, Kaman, and other populations in Rakhine State. But one of our recommendations is for Rohingya aid workers that are working for humanitarian organizations, for them not to be forced or coerced to take the NVC card, and for their positions to be flexible. So then they don't need to necessarily always be going to the field if they don't want to take an NVC. So yeah, those are some of our maybe practical recommendations. Yeah, handing it over to Dr. Parveen, who might have more to say.
Just to add with John, we have, I personally have daily contacts with my relatives, especially, and some of my relatives, very close ones, are still living in Mongdo, and they are forced, they become sick, very critical. I have 2 aunties who are very sick, and then they had to travel to different places for the doctor. So they are checked every point, and then they are asked to take the NVC. And with the civil society, I think what I got it, there are still some organizations are still working, but they don't pay so much of attention, and such that NVC is a genocidal tool, further genocidal tool of genocide against the Rohingyas. They don't pay so much attention. And even there were people, some civil societies working over there. If you, some Rohingyas come to them, or as any other civil society member say, this is a Rohingya, this guy, he is a Rohingya, they will say, no, do not address yourself as Rohingya. It's better that you present yourself as Rakhine or whatever it is, but they don't take these steps seriously, or even they avoid. Unfortunately, the civil society over there, they avoid, and they say this is the, still people don't understand that this is a genocide against Rohingya happening. They take it that it's an internal problem, it's the problem between the religious problem or other issues, they will say, but they don't see it as a genocide. Unfortunately, still many people, though I must say that, there are 54 million Burmese people are there, but majority of them still don't believe that the Rohingyas went through the genocide. Thank you.
So we have someone who's been waiting with their hand up for quite a long time. So I'm going to try and bring them into the room to ask their question directly. So this is 𝘕𝘠𝘪𝘐, and see if we can bring them in. Oh, I think they may have disappeared. Maybe got some cold feet. So if not, then I'll go over to, oh, Here 𝘕𝘠𝑠𝑎𝑟𝑢 is. 𝘕𝘠𝑠𝑎𝑟𝑢, can you hear us?
Yes.
Feel free to ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, panelists. I actually wanted to follow up on, I am trying to like bridge these two issues, very important for us, because like when the panelists have discussed about the tools that are used for Rohingya genocide, especially the citizenship verification cards and many other tools, like for Rohingyas, like as legal aid people who we have a very specific Rohingya-led, Rohingya lead kind of legal aid cases, specifically in human trafficking, and what we have. All of us have advocated very much during the 2019 and 20. So what happens in the due process change in the courts is that when people, especially the Rohingya communities, have human trafficking victims who were caught, for example, in Yangon, things like that, what happened even with the MVC card and even with the pink card, even with the full citizenship card, what happened to them is, unlike any other human trafficking victims, they were treated as criminals instead of as victims. So why they were victims, when they got caught, they not just the trafficking, the actual criminals, they as the victims were, sort of like arrested and detained and given like very big sentences, like 5 years to how many multiplied by many townships, like very long, prison sentences because of the breach of citizenship laws. So we have, all of us advocated for that. So now, for the 2 years between 2019 and 2020, there was this small period of time where the NAPIDO was considering them as victims, also thanks to UN Special Envoy Office. So there was a standing order. But as soon as the coup kicked in, it reversed back. And now everybody is getting past all these like sentences back again. So what we are trying to say is why these things since February 1st, 2021 until now, just like a few days ago, are still happening when we are ongoing with this like ICJ case, while despite the fact that Prudential's committee decision is still pending, and why we are all working on this engagement with the military. On this particular case, we are ongoing with military as a sort of like a counterparty. So what I'm trying to say is, it seems like logical because they are the one who actually committed all these atrocities, and especially in the form of genocide. But now, giving them sort of like this light of being a legitimate government indirectly, does it help us as like for the Rohingyas, especially because if we were to recognize the 𝘎𝘠𝘠 and the NUG government as the elected government, if they say they admitted, yes, they committed that crime and then they need to be fixed, then the problem is almost, well, like, let me ask this very naive question, because it could be like, yes, the government, kind of like found it's guilty. And then if that is so, then there are measures that can be, in place right away, in Burma, So is it not something, that can be more direct and a faster route than engaging with the military as the counterparty in this like ICJ case? Because we are still confused as to, on the ground, there is nothing changing. And it's getting even worse, even though there's very superficial layer of, just trying to shut us up by saying, okay, we are doing things, great. So military is not doing that. So I am frustrated on the ground because we just have very big spike in the trafficking cases, and every single case is getting worse than, how worse it was in 2015 until now, but worse is still happening. So I'm just thinking out loud, as in, is ICJ thing, if the NUG admitted, they have this apology, if they say, yes, we are guilty, is it not a solution? Is there something that we can do? Because we Rohingyas, like, speaking of Mr. Solomon case, like Way Forward, they were part of, sort of like February 3rd, 2021, in GSC, General Strike Committee. There were leaders there, they're still, and then we also need to advocate for way forward with the NUG and the current stakeholders so that they have a space on the table, which they don't have it yet. And now military and ICJ things going, there is nothing happening there yet. Even if it is happening, will we end up, acknowledging military as a legitimate government? And if so, will that really change? I'm sorry, sir and ma'ams. I just wanted to, get some thoughts from you.
Thank you, Thanzar'u. We can hear the frustration in your voice and just all the challenges that you're raising. Arsalan, do you want to address that and some of those points around the ICJ case?
Yeah, I'll just say that I can understand the frustration of everyone who wants to see the elected government be recognized as the appropriate government because they were elected. And of course, for anyone who believes in democracy, you would want to see the elected governments have that recognition. We, meaning the Gambia, had no say in terms of what the court did in terms of its process for allowing the junta regime to represent Myanmar in the latest hearing. The court did not explain its decision, but there was a sentence that the president read out when she began the hearing, in which she said that the court doesn't recognize governments. The state is the party in the proceeding, something along those lines. It's not a direct quote, but that was the gist of her statement. And what I think the takeaway there is that the fact that the court allowed the junta representatives to represent the state in the proceedings is not a statement on their legitimacy. It's not a statement on their on whether it's right for them to do so or not. I think what that was that the court determined that in terms of the de facto control of the majority of the state functions, that the junta had that control of those authorities, and therefore, in order to get the party that most fully exercises the levers of power of the state, that they were the more appropriate party. Again, just to emphasize, and this is just my own interpretation of what the court was saying there, it's not a recognition, it's not a statement of legitimacy. States are the ones in the international system who can recognize other governments, and states are the ones who can accord other governments with legitimacy. And so it's really a matter of encouraging other states to recognize the NUG if that's what the community wants to see happen. And so I know that's been a part of the advocacy efforts to get other states to recognize the NUG, for example. I mean, that is, I think, in the international system, generally the procedure by which governments can achieve recognition by the actions of other states. And in terms of the legitimacy question, I think certainly that we've seen the United Nations collectively reject the coup and condemn the coup and others. And so I think the legitimacy question is pretty clear. But it's a very unfortunately frustrating situation, because in these types of situations where you have a junta exercising and executing a coup, it's the people who are suffering. It's the ousted government that was legitimately elected under the rules at the time that is not allowed to exercise the powers that it was elected to do so. And so I just wanted to give that perspective from in terms of the case itself and what the court said on it. And again, it wasn't anything that the Gambia as a party to the case was able to weigh in on or to even comment on. That was the court. It's the court's role to make those determinations on its own.
Thank you so much for that. I hope that answer gives us a good direction of areas where we can focus on for advocacy, and the challenges continue, but we also need to continue moving on. So that's super helpful. I think we're about out of time, so I'll just go to the final round of any final reflections or comments that people would like to give for the panelists. So if I can go to Dr. Parveen and start with you for your final thoughts.
Thank you once again, Fortify Rights, for your great work. As I've said, these are the reports which will put weight. While I was reading this report, I was happy. Oh yes, the perpetrators will be accountable very fast. At the same time, I was very sad that our people are still going through genocide. And also, I was seeing hope through this report that such reports will be making a history of Rohingya. How did we go through the genocide? And unfortunately, we Rohingyas are still the testimonials. We give interviews. We are still very not majority of us cannot write reports, don't have those facilities to think, to write, to make it so professional. It is because we were lack of education. It's not only the citizenship rights were deprived from us. One of them, we never had the education to fight for our people, to report for our people, to document for our people, which continues further in Bangladesh. I would like to request, through the accountability, it will take time, but that does not mean we should become further illiterate, that some other people have to help us. It's good to have friends in solidarity, but we want to write our own stories. Give us pen, give us paper. Instead of food, instead of water, those plastic shelters, till you are still not able to repatriate us with full citizenship rights, give us a pen and a paper so that I and our people can write our own stories, especially those children, especially those youth who are waiting for their justice. Thank you. Thank you once again, Fortify Rights. Really, such reports are going to help, and I hope that the other organizations will also take such steps to further document the genocidal tools happening against Rohingyas in our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Parveen. We really appreciate it, and all that you do too for the Rohingya community. So thank you. Arsalan, can we go to you next for final thoughts, final reflections?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. And thanks again to the Fortify Rights team and all of the Rohingya community organizations, Dr. Parveen and others who contributed to the report and who constantly are doing the necessary advocacy and documentation work that makes accountability processes possible. I just wanted to close by saying that the ICJ case process is continuing. We expect and hope to see the court's decision on the preliminary objections relatively soon. And after, we expect a successful outcome at that phase, and after that, to move to the merits phase. And so I just wanted to thank everyone who does this important documentation work and the advocacy work. And I know it can be tiring, it can be frustrating, especially in the current context where violations are ongoing and are spreading and are affecting all aspects and ethnic groups and everyone across the country in Myanmar. And so I know it's a very tough situation, but this work matters. This work is really important. And it's because of work like this that change can happen, and I think change will happen. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. It's very encouraging to hear that. And over to John for final remarks.
Thank you to all the participants that are still tuned in. I really appreciate it. Just on the Rohingya, kind of pulling off what Dr. Parveen was saying, there's many Rohingya civil society groups in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, and globally that are doing human rights research, that are doing human rights documentation, and that have been raising the alarm, that have been talking about the NVC process and its problems for a long time, much before Fortify Rights was. And we support these groups and we lean on them to try to guide us in doing our documentation work. So yeah, I'm appreciative of those Rohingya groups, and they should be supported. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I know there was a lot of questions that are still coming in and people with their hands up. It's really great to see so much interest in this issue. I do want to encourage everyone to please download the report and our news release. We also have a film coming out, a short film that summarizes the findings of the report as well as the recommendations, which you can find on our social media platforms. But we really appreciate the time that people have come in and contributed some questions and engaged in this conversation. And hopefully we can continue this conversation moving forward. Thank you so much, Arsalan, for joining and for your contributions and all you're doing to move forward the accountability mechanisms. And also Dr. Parveen for all that you're doing with the Rohingya community. It truly means a lot to so many people. So thank you. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in, and please download the report. Yeah, we just would like to thank you.